I won't start over, but I'll back up. Okay. So everybody knows there were 613 mitzvot, right? Everybody knows that. But over the generations, a number of different scholars have set out to make a list of the 613 mitzvot in the Torah, and no two lists agree. Okay, there are differences about whether this thing or that thing is actually a mitzvah or not. There's differences about whether something is one mitzvah or two. I mean, for example, if you look at the 10 Commandments, right? Do not covet your neighbor's house, do not covet your neighbor's wife or their cattle. Is that one mitzvah or more than one mitzvah, right? So, right, it's like coveting the house, one mitzvah, coveting the wife, another mitzvah, etc., right? But according to almost all of those lists, mitzvah number 612 is contained in this parsha. It is the mitzvah of hakel. Hakel means to gather, right? I mean, you see the root kuf hey lamed in there. If you don't know the root kuf hey lamed, you're in the wrong place, because this is Kehilat Shalom, which has that root in it, right? So it's a hefil, which means causative, cause the people to gather. And this is Deuteronomy 31, 10 through 13. At the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the strangers living in your town, so they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. Their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. Okay, so every 7th year, at least in theory, the entire people during Sukkot is supposed to come up to Jerusalem, and the Torah will be read out loud in their midst. Okay, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that this is in essence a reenactment of the covenant ceremony, right? We had several covenant ceremonies. They stood at Mount Sinai and they said, right, everything that God has spoken, we will do, right? And then they're told that when they enter the land, right, half the people stand on Mount Gerizim, and half the people stand on Mount Ebal, and they go through this covenant ceremony again, right? That the covenant is not imposed by God, it's ratified. And therefore, it needs to be renewed every now and then. Okay, and Maimonides actually lays out how it was done in Hilchot Hagiga, but Maimonides lived quite a long time after the biblical era, and just because Maimonides says this is what they did and how they did it, doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case, right? And we don't know to what extent it was actually practiced, although we do have mention of it. I mean, the book of Joshua says that Joshua had this ceremony at the end of his life. Now, I have to say, I'm not 100% certain that the book of Joshua is historical, but Josiah did it after the discovery or rediscovery of the book of Deuteronomy, and Josiah, say with pretty high degree of certainty, was a real person who actually lived. And if if we read that Josiah did this, he probably did. And similarly for Ezra, for the generation that returned from Babylon. Ezra gathered the entire people, although interestingly enough, Ezra did it not on Sukkot, but on Rosh Hashanah. But it's the exact same ceremony. Okay, and the purpose of this is not just ritual, right? It's covenantal politics, right? The philosopher Philip Selznick, in his book, The Moral Commonwealth, writes, the compact creates a self-conscious moral order. Most vividly at Sinai, the agreement with God is an agreement to uphold a code of responsible conduct. God's commands are obeyed by fulfilling obligations to family and community. A social ethic is the linchpin of the covenant. In other words, our duty to God isn't just prayer and ritual, right? It's not that we simply owe God, I don't know, to keep kosher or observe Shabbos, right? We owe God certain obligations to our community and obligations to society and obligations to our family. So if we let down our community, we also let down God. If we let down our family, we also let down God. Covenantal politics or moral politics, they involve ideas of duty and obligation. They are also interwoven with a particular view of the history of the nation whose fate is seen as a reflection of its success or failure in honoring the terms laid down by its founders. Okay, Rabbi Sachs, in his Devar Torah on this Parsha, points out, and I've said this before, Rabbi Sachs, I think, admired the United States in a way that only foreigners can. I mean, and I don't mean that sarcastically at all, but I think he was admiring of our society's virtues and somewhat blind to its flaws because he didn't live here. I mean, he spent a lot of time here, but he didn't live here. But also one of his goals, I think, was to make the UK more like the United States. Okay, why? I mean, this is my reading of Sachs. This is not anything that Sachs ever said. Is that because there is a sense in the UK that you are really British by virtue of descent, right? And you are really British, that to be really British is to be Anglican, right? After all, the monarch is not only head of state, right? The monarch is head of the church, a defender of the faith, right? And even though there's no formal rule that the prime minister has to be Anglican, I don't know, and I'm not an expert in British history, so I don't know, but I don't know whether there has ever been a prime minister who was not Anglican, right? Disraeli was born a Jew. His family converted to Anglicanism when he was a child. He was of Jewish descent, but he was a member of the Anglican Church. And conversely, Tony Blair converted to Roman Catholicism, but he did not become Catholic until after he was no longer prime minister and no longer involved in politics. Okay, so I honestly don't know, but the idea is that, right, there is a certain sense that you cannot become British in the way that you can become American. And this is not true only of the UK. I mean, I discussed the fact that I had relatives who survived the Holocaust and then moved to France. Okay, and eventually from France, they moved to Israel. because they felt that they would, and even though their kids were born in France, okay, so fine, so you know, the older generation spoke with an accent and whatever, right? But the kids were born in France, right? But they said, we will never be French. We will never be French. We will never be accepted as French because we're Jews, right? That to be French is to be Catholic. To be British is to be, or to be English for sure, is to be Anglican. I mean, the Scots are Presbyterian for the most part, but at any rate, you know, you can't, and Sachs wanted British Jews to be accepted as really British, right? And so he points out that the only modern nation that constructed its politics in terms of covenant is the United States, right? I mean, when you take the oath of office, if you've ever held any, like when you joined the Foreign Service, what did you swear allegiance to? The Constitution, right? When I've been sworn into office too. When I was chairman of the Ethics Commission of the city of Norwich, Connecticut, I swore my allegiance to the Constitution. Brian, I don't know if you ever took an oath, right? But if you did, you took an oath to the Constitution, right? Not to the president, right? Whereas, you know, in the UK, you swear allegiance to, not to the Constitution, but to the monarch, right? We are a covenantal polity, right? And it's odd to me that when he writes this, he does not point out that the Hebrew name for the United States is Artsot Habrit, right? Lands of the covenant, okay? Not United States, lands of the covenant, right? So in Hebrew, explicitly, what holds this country together is a brit, a covenant, okay? And so if you have a covenant, you have to have a covenant ratification ceremony and a covenant renewal ceremony. Okay, and what is the covenant renewal ceremony that we have in this country? Rabbi Sachs, working based on the work of Robert Bellah, the great sociologist of civil religion, says that the presidential inaugural address is an American version of Hakel. Okay, that the president, first of all, always invokes God, but more than that, they give a covenantal vision and version of history, okay? And so he brings a paragraph from LBJ's inaugural address and George W. Bush's inaugural address, and they're quite similar. So here's from LBJ. They came here, the exile and the stranger, brave but frightened, to find a place where a man could be his own man. That's the Texas version. That's right. They made a covenant with this land, conceived in justice, written in liberty, bound in union. It was meant one day to inspire the hopes of all mankind, and it binds us still. If we keep its terms, we shall flourish. Here's George W. Bush. America's vital interests and our deepest beliefs are now one. From the day of our founding, we have proclaimed that every man and woman on this earth has rights and dignity and matchless value because they bear the image of the maker of heaven and earth. Across the generations, we have proclaimed the imperative of self-government because no one is fit to be a master and no one deserves to be a slave. Advancing these ideals is the mission that created our nation. History has an ebb and flow of justice, but history also has a visible direction set by liberty and the author of liberty. Right? And this is the covenantal vision. Now I have to say, right, that we have not always lived up to that vision, right? I mean, we always proclaimed it, but we always fell short, right? And if you've watched, Kelly and I have watched so far the first installment of Ken Burns' documentary, America and the Holocaust, right? And the rhetoric that was used to keep Jews out is exactly the same rhetoric that is being used today to keep other refugees out, right? Too crowded, they won't fit in, you know, I don't even have to go in, we all know, right? And you know, in Hebrew, there's this phrase, Otagi veret b'shinui adera, okay? Same lady, different dress, right? And that's what is the same lady, different dress, right? I mean, and the kind of rhetoric that was used in the early 1900s. I mean, there was a police commissioner in New York, Bingham, who claimed that more than half of the crimes in New York were committed by Jews, and that Jews were pimps and rapists and so on. I mean, where have we heard that before? Right? Except, you know, take out Jews and put in Mexicans, and it's the exact same rhetoric, right? So we haven't lived up to that dream at all, but at the same time, right, there is this sense that nationhood is not based on shared descent. Right? I mean, that if there is such a thing as heresy in the American context, it is saying to somebody, you know, because your ancestors came from X place and you follow X religion, and I don't care what the X is, you're not really American, right? The only real Americans are white Christians, right? And then beyond that, the only real Americans are white Protestants, right? And there has always been that undertone, but, you know, every president, pretty much without exception, has condemned it. And it is literally heresy against the American creed, right? And in that, the United States is somewhat unusual because you can become really American because it is based on shared values and an idea of covenant, and it is possible to join that covenant, right? The question really is, you know, what holds us together today, right? And here, I think, you know, Sachs, maybe because, look, I mean, Queen Elizabeth was always just the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen, throughout. I mean, Sachs died, he was like a couple years ago, he was like in his early 70s, but for all of his conscious life, it was Her Majesty the Queen, right? And the question, and it's very interesting that, I mean, I think in some ways the Queen did hold that country together in ways that we're only really starting to understand now. Because even like, to my astonishment, frankly, the people in Scotland who want Scotland to be independent from the UK had always said, we will be independent from the UK, but the Queen will still be the Queen of Scotland. Okay, now, of course, I mean, she is descended from, she was, I should say, descended from Scottish royalty as well as English royalty. Okay, so there's maybe some logic there, but right, but she held that country together, and it'll be really interesting to see to what extent that unity will fracture now that she's gone, right? And then the question is, what whole, you know, I mean, maybe I'm excessively pessimistic, but I see this country fracturing because more and more people are not loyal to that covenant. They believe that you are American by virtue of race and religion and descent and not by covenant, right? And then other people react and say, well, the heck with them, right? I mean, and in a way, I mean, you know, if I ask what holds the Jewish people together, right? And there is something, I mean, how many times have I spoken in the last few weeks about what's going on with Yeshiva University and the Gay Student Alliance? Why do I care? Right? I'm not an alumnus of Yeshiva University. I'm not gay. And I'm not a modern Orthodox Jew. Why do I even care? Right? But why do I care? Because we're part of the same people. We're part of the same community, right? I mean, I don't know what's going on with gay students at Brigham Young University, and I don't really care, right? I mean, I certainly wish them well, but you know, it doesn't. I don't really care because I'm not part of that community, right? But when I read about Yeshiva University, or I read in the New York Times about Hasidic schools that provide no secular education, I care because we are part of the same community. And if you ask me to explain it rationally, I don't know if I could, right? But we're part of the same community. But there are some of my fellow Americans that I have to say, what exactly binds me to them, right? Other than you know, a little pamphlet with a blue cover and pink pages, right? I mean, I don't know anymore. And I think we are fracturing because that loyalty to the covenant idea is not holding us together anymore. Those are my thoughts. I certainly welcome any questions or comments, but I do think if we're going to find a way forward, we have to find a way to rededicate ourselves to that idea of covenant, that this is really Artsot Habrit, the land of the covenant, and not, you know, not based on something else. Yeah, Barnaby.
I think that yeah, just kind of our perspective.
Okay, Mark, can I ask you to like actually stand a little closer to the owl so that people on Zoom can hear you?
Okay. So, y'all hear me back there? Okay. Just my perspective as you know, someone who is of a much younger generation and has witnessed a lot of you know, discourse, particularly around you know, people who aren't like outsiders, people of color, non-Christians, especially Muslims. In that lately there have been many uprisings, so to speak. Of course, everyone here knows about movement for Black Lives, aka Black Lives Matter. But then there's also the Stop Asian Hate movement. And what I've also noticed is that there isn't that much of an Americanness to some of them. It is largely born out of self-defense. It actually reminds me a lot of Black nationalism back in the 60s and 70s, in that a lot of these marginalized peoples feel that, you know, the covenant never really applied to them.
Right.
And so they want to chart their, you know, own separate path. And contrast this, you know, we see the contrast between the likes of, you know, the Black Panthers, which were explicitly nationalists and possibly separatists. And you'll have the civil rights movement, which was all about upholding an ideal enshrined in the Constitution, however much in history was not applied properly. And I think, a covenant is only as valid as it is applied from above, and B, it's applied from below. And the more we see, the covenant being misapplied from above, the marginalized will react in kind, so to speak. They'll say if America does not include, those of us who are darker skinned or do not pray to Jesus, then we don't want any part of America. And I'll be the first to admit that I honestly felt guilty of this many times.
Sure.
Despite how American civil religion has been inculcated in me since birth, to be honest. And there's always this feeling of, does this, if this has never really been, land of the free, home of the brave, then why should I pick any part of it?
Sure.
But in the end, this is how we're gonna wrap up. In the end, as long as my family, others like me, but others very much unlike me, are not being whose needs aren't really being met by the government, or not just but by society around which this covenant is built. If the needs aren't being met, I still feel that it's upon all of us really to make sure that their needs are met, so that they are welcomed into the covenant, and so that they continue to build a society together. That's the best I can put it.
Right. No, look, it is. I mean, I would have two thoughts on that. One is that, I remember when I was the Hillel director at the University of Virginia, and it was just at the time when the terminology was starting to change from Black to African American, right? And I was having lunch with the head of the Black Student Union, and I asked him, I said, do you prefer Black or African American? He said, just African. I said, I'm not American. And I said, let me tell you something. I understand why you think that. Go to Africa and see how American you really are, right? And I feel that way. I never say I'm not American, okay, but I feel much more American in Israel, right, than I do here, where I feel much more Jewish, right? So that's one thought. But the other is, look, I do not want to get into this whole argument of the whiteness of Jews or whatever, right? But the overwhelming, so 80–90% of American Jews can pass for white, right? And so the difference is that if I walk around without a kippah, nobody necessarily knows I'm Jewish. You walk around without a kippah, everybody still knows that you're Asian, and that is a difference, which makes it, easier. I don't know there's a song, Peter Himmelman has a song about being in a taxi with a driver who was a neo-Nazi, right? Who obviously didn't realize that Himmelman was Jewish, was spouting off all this horrible stuff, and he's sitting there and he doesn't know whether to say anything or not, and he decides not to. Right? I mean, it's not going to happen to you in terms of it might happen to you in terms of anti-Semitism, but it wouldn't happen to you in terms of anti-Asian bigotry because, it's, so that's different. I mean, it is different for people and it is different for Jews of color than for Jews who appear white. There's no question about it. But, what I would say is that, the success of the civil rights movement was precisely because Dr. King could call Americans to being their best selves, right? In the same sense that, Maimonides says every Jew wants to do the will of God, they sometimes just don't know it, right? And so you have to remind them, right? And King would call people to be, he would say, this is really who you want to be, you just don't know it yet. And sometimes he was right, sometimes he was wrong, but he called people to, and so, the founding documents say the right things, even if the actions don't always match up to the words, and that I think is at least something. But I don't gainsay the difficulty for, particularly for people who are marginalized and who, by virtue of skin color or whatever, have a much more difficult time of assimilating. Like when I see Christian nationalists with Italian last names, they may not realize that, 2 generations ago, are Italians really white? And now they're white nationalists. But it's harder for Blacks and Asians and Latinos. Harder for you also to become a white nationalist. All right, let's continue on. With Musaf, we won't say the Hatzi Kaddish because that's tied to the Torah service. So we